The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which struck her as cruel. Tuesdays were supposed to be unremarkable. Maren Calloway had been standing at the window of the solicitor's outer office when the clerk handed it to her without meeting her eyes. She had known before she broke the seal, before she unfolded the single sheet of paper inside, that whatever was written there would change the particular shape of her life. She had not known it would unmake it entirely. Her uncle had filed the papers 3 weeks after her father's funeral. He had waited long enough that she might have believed herself safe, and she understood now that the waiting had been deliberate. A kindness, he had called it, when he explained it to her in the parlor of what had, until that morning, been her home. He was giving her time to grieve before he gave her the news. The news was this: her father had borrowed against the estate, heavily and for years, in a manner that her father's solicitor described with careful, bloodless language as deeply irregular. The creditor to whom those debts were owed was her uncle, Mr. Desmond Calloway, her father's younger brother, who had spent the better part of a decade extending loans he knew could never be repaid. The estate, Thornfield Grange, the house she had been born in, the house where her mother had died, the house with the cracked plaster ceiling in the east hallway that she had stared at every morning of her childhood, had passed to Desmond Calloway as settlement of those debts. Maren was 24 years old. She had no brothers. Her mother's family was scattered and distant. She had, as the solicitor phrased it, no immediate recourse. What she had was a name she did not intend to use. Northgate Hall sat at the end of a long approach road, on the far side of a stone bridge that crossed the River Len. She had passed it twice as a girl, traveling north with her father, and she remembered it as a dark shape against darker hills, solid and lightless, and very, very large. Closer, it was no less imposing. The stone was gray limestone, old enough to have turned the color of a winter sky, and the windows were tall and narrow and offered nothing of what lay inside. She had learned, through a series of inquiries she had made carefully, and at some distance from anyone who might recognize her, that the housekeeper at Northgate Hall had been seeking a new parlor maid for 2 months. The previous girl had departed without notice. The girl before that had also departed without notice. The position had gone unfilled because the hall's reputation in the nearest village was not a comfortable one, and because the man who owned it was not a comfortable man. His name was Aldrich Vane. She had checked the list of names she carried in her memory 3 times over, and she was certain he was not connected to her father's creditors. He had no reason to know who she was, and he lived, for reasons she did not fully understand, almost entirely alone in a house that required, according to the woman at the post office in Len Bridge, at least a dozen people to run properly. He was currently running it with 4. Maren had presented herself at the servants' entrance on a gray Wednesday morning in March, carrying a single bag and a reference letter she had composed herself and signed with a name she had invented. She had dressed plainly and pulled her hair back in a way that made her look older and less distinctive, and when the housekeeper, a thin woman named Mrs. Aldrich, had opened the door and looked at her with the particular assessment of someone who had been disappointed before, Maren had returned the look steadily. "You've done parlor work?" Mrs. Aldrich asked. "Yes, ma'am. 3 years in Dunmore, and before that 2 in Edinburgh." Neither was true, but she had grown up in a house with parlor maids, and she had paid attention, and she was prepared to learn quickly whatever she had missed. Mrs. Aldrich looked at her for a long moment. "The work here is not light," she said. "His Grace keeps unusual hours. He does not permit noise in the upper corridor after 9 o'clock in the evening. He does not permit staff in the library under any circumstances. He dines alone and does not require serving at table. He takes a tray. You will have no occasion to speak to him directly unless he addresses you first, which he is unlikely to do. Is that understood?" "Yes, ma'am." Your name? She had prepared for this. Clara Marsh, she said, and the lie came out clean, the way lies do when you have rehearsed them long enough that they stop feeling dishonest and start feeling simply necessary. Mrs. Aldwych nodded once and stepped back to let her in. The hall was cold in a way that had nothing to do with the season. The fires were kept burning, the hallways were not drafty, and the stone walls were thick enough that the March wind outside made almost no impression on the rooms within. But there was a quality to the air in the upper floors, a stillness, an absence of the sounds that a house usually makes when people move through it and talk in it and live in their ordinary ways. That made Maren feel, in those first days, as though she had walked into a building that had been holding its breath for a very long time. She was good at finding things out. She had always been good at it, even as a girl. She knew how to make herself useful and agreeable and forgettable in the way that made people speak freely around her. She knew how to ask the kinds of questions that did not sound like questions. And within 4 days of arriving at Northgate Hall, she had learned the following things about Aldwych Vane, the Duke of Keswick. He was 36 years old. He had inherited the title and the hall and the considerable holdings attached to both at the age of 22, following the deaths of his father and older brother in a carriage accident on the road south from Edinburgh. He had been, before that accident, the second son, the one who was not expected to inherit, the one who had spent 20 at university and later in Edinburgh practicing as a barrister, the one who he had been good at it, or so the rumor ran. He had given it up when he became the Duke, come to Northgate Hall, and not left since. He had been at Northgate Hall for 14 years. The estate itself was, by any measure, enormous. She knew this, not because anyone told her directly, but because she was good at arithmetic, and the delivery schedules she helped to organize told their own story. The farms alone covered several thousand acres. There were holdings in Inverness and in Edinburgh that the factor managed from a distance. Aldwych Vane was, in the plain language of the thing, one of the wealthiest men in the north of Scotland. He was also apparently content to live as though this were not the case, in a house that ran on 4 staff instead of the 14 it required, in rooms that were clean but not warm and tended but not lived in. She did not see him for the first 6 days. On the 7th, she was crossing the main hall with a basket of clean linens when a door opened at the far end of the corridor, and he walked through it. She had built a picture of him from the fragments she had collected, and it was accurate in the rough outlines but not in the particular way a person's face is different from any description of it. He was tall, with dark hair that wanted cutting, and the kind of stillness in his bearing that was either self-possession or something colder. He was not looking at her. He was reading a letter, walking with the practiced inattention of a man who knew every inch of the floor he was crossing without needing to look at it. He was almost at the foot of the stairs when he glanced up. She dipped her head. "Your Grace." He looked at her for exactly the amount of time it took to determine that she was staff and therefore required no further consideration. Then he was past her and on the stairs, and she was standing in the hall with her basket of linens, listening to his footsteps recede above her. She let out a breath she had not meant to hold. She had come to Northgate Hall for a reason that was not the one she had given Mrs. Aldwych. 2 weeks before her father's funeral, during those suspended, unreal days when the house had been full of distant relatives and her uncle had not yet filed his papers, she had found something in her father's study. She had not been looking for it. She had been looking for his will because the solicitor had asked her to, and she had been going through the lower drawer of his desk when her fingers found the corner of a folder that had been pushed to the very back. Inside the folder were letters, 18 of them, dated across a period of 7 years. They were written in her father's hand, addressed to a man whose name she did not recognize, and they described in careful, precise language a financial arrangement. Not the borrowing from her uncle, but something else. Something that predated the debts by nearly a decade. Her father had invested heavily and wrongly in a venture that had failed, and he had borrowed against it to cover the loss, and the man he had borrowed from was named Forsyth Aldenmuir, who was the late father of the current Duke of Keswick. The debt had been forgiven. She found that much in the letters, too. Forsyth Aldenmuir had written to her father in 1891 and told him that the remaining sum was cleared. No explanation given, no conditions attached. Simply, the debt is forgiven. Consider it done. Her father had kept those letters at the back of a drawer for the remainder of his life. He had never told her they existed. She did not know what the current Duke knew. She did not know whether the forgiveness had been properly recorded, or whether there were other papers, or whether any of this was connected to the debts what her uncle had used to take the estate. Or she did not even know with any certainty what she was looking for, but she knew that the answers, if there were any, were more likely to be at Northgate Hall than anywhere else. That was why she was here. Not because she needed work, because her father's papers had led here, and she had nowhere else to go, and she was not yet willing to accept that there was nothing to be done. March became April. The hills above the valley turned from brown to the preliminary green that precedes real spring. Maren learned the rhythms of the house. What time Mrs. Aldwick conducted her morning inspection of the ground floor, where the cook kept the key to the dry larder, which floorboards on the second-floor landing made a sound and should be avoided. She learned that the Duke's library was not simply off-limits, but actively avoided by every member of staff, as though proximity to the room were itself a small transgression. She learned that he worked through most of the night and slept through most of the morning, and that the house organized itself around this fact with the quiet efficiency of long habit. She learned that he was not, as she had half expected from the reputation, cruel. He was distant, in the way that some people are distant when they have spent too long inside their own heads and forgotten how to be otherwise. He did not speak to the staff unnecessarily. He did not speak to anyone unnecessarily. But when Mrs. Aldwick had fallen on the back step in the 3rd week of April and turned her ankle badly, he had sent for the doctor from Len Bridge himself, and when the doctor had come, he had been the one who met him at the door rather than waiting for one of the remaining staff to do it. She had watched this from the kitchen passage and thought about it for longer than made sense. It was in the 4th week of April that she got into the library. She was not proud of how she did it. She had found the key on Mrs. Aldwick's ring one evening when the housekeeper was resting her ankle, and she had made a wax impression of it in the kitchen with the stub of a candle, in the way she had once read about in a novel, and had never expected to actually use. It had taken her 2 days to find someone in Len Bridge who could make a duplicate. It had cost her most of what she had left. The library was at the end of the east wing, behind a door that looked no different from any other door on that corridor, except that it was always closed. She went in on a Thursday afternoon when the Duke was out for rare and brief rides across the estate, and she did not light the lamp because she did not want the light visible under the door. She had 20 minutes, maybe 30. The room was large. The shelves ran floor to ceiling on 3 walls, and the 4th wall was windows looking out over the north garden. There was a large desk in the center of the room, and on the desk there were papers, not stacked neatly but spread in the organized disorder of someone who knew exactly where everything was, and would notice immediately if anything were moved. She did not touch the papers on the desk. She went to the shelves on the south wall, where she had noticed, during her single previous glimpse through the briefly opened door, a section of the shelving that held not books but box files. She found the section and began reading labels in the gray afternoon light. Correspondence, Aldenmere Estate. Correspondence, Edinburgh Factor. Correspondence, Legal, General. She found it in the fourth box she tried. Correspondence, Ashbourne and Calloway. The Calloway was her own name, and the sight of it in that context made her hands go entirely steady in the way that extreme things sometimes make the hands steady. Inside the box were copies of the letters she already knew, her father's letters and his father's replies. But there were others beneath them that she had not seen before. A final accounting, dated September 1892, noting the forgiveness of the debt in full, and below that, a note in a different hand. Not the late Duke's, not her father's, but smaller and more deliberate, the hand of someone making a record for their own purposes. The note said, "Debt cleared. No claim on Calloway estate. To be honored by successor if relevant." She read it twice, then she heard footsteps in the corridor. She had the box back on the shelf and was halfway to the door before she understood that the footsteps were not passing. They were stopping. The door handle moved. There was nowhere to go. The windows were closed and 2 floors above the ground, and not an option. She was standing in the middle of the room with a locked door that she had unlocked, and a key that she had duplicated, and no explanation for any of it that would survive contact with the truth. The door opened. Aldrich Vane stood in the doorway. He looked at her for a long moment, and she watched him take in the scene. The room, her presence in it, the absence of any legitimate reason for either. And she watched his expression move through several things before settling on something controlled and unreadable. "You are the new parlour maid," he said. It was not a question. "Yes, Your Grace. Mrs. Aldrich told me your name was Marsh. Yes, Your Grace." He stepped into the room and closed the door behind him, and she understood that this was not going to end with a simple dismissal and a reference withheld. "My library," he said, "is not open to staff. I know. I'm sorry. Are you?" He moved to the desk, not toward her, and stood with one hand resting on the edge of it. He was looking at her with the same directness he had turned on the letter in the hall 4 weeks ago, except that this time it was turned on her. "What were you looking for?" She had prepared for many things in the preceding weeks. She had not prepared for the question to be asked that directly, and that soon. She had prepared for accusation, for the assumption of theft, for the particular coldness of someone who has caught a servant somewhere she should not be. She had not prepared for a man who skipped past all of those responses and went straight to the only question that actually mattered. She made a decision. It was not a calculated decision. She was too tired for calculations. "My name is not Marsh," she said. "My name is Maren Calloway." The silence that followed was the kind that has weight to it. "Calloway?" he said. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. She watched him, and she thought she saw something shift in his face, not recognition exactly, but something that preceded it. "Your father was Thomas Calloway," he said, "of Thornfield Grange, in the Borders. He died in January." "Yes." Another silence. He moved from the desk to the windows and stood looking out at the north garden. And she stood where she was and waited, because she had run out of moves and was now simply waiting to see what he would do. "I was told," he said without turning from the window, "that the estate had passed to a brother. I was told there were no children." She felt something tighten in her chest. Desmond Calloway told people that. Why? Because it was easier than explaining why a daughter with no brothers and no debts of her own, had still lost everything. He turned from the window. "Your uncle, my father's brother. He spent 8 years making loans to my father, keeping careful records, waiting. My father did not know, or did not allow himself to know, what was being built around him." She paused. "I found your father's letters, in my father's desk, after he died. The forgiveness." Yes, he looked at her for a long time. She did not look away because she was done with looking away. She had been here for 6 weeks, and she had been careful and small and invisible, and it had brought her to this room and this moment, and she was not going to undo it now by flinching. "Sit down, Miss Calloway," he said. She sat. He asked her questions for the better part of an hour. They were not hostile questions. They were the questions of someone who has been presented with a problem and is determining its dimensions before he does anything else with it. He asked about the timeline of the debts. He asked about the specific language in her uncle's filing. He asked about the solicitor she had spoken to, and whether she had retained any original documents, and whether anyone else knew she was here. She answered everything. She was too tired to manage information, and she was not certain it would have helped her if she had been. At some point, Mrs. Aldwych brought a tea tray, not to Maren, but to the Duke, who was sitting at his desk by this point, with several of the box files open before him. The housekeeper looked at Maren once, with an expression that was carefully nothing, and withdrew. "My father's note," he said when the door had closed. He was looking at the small slip of paper she had found at the bottom of the correspondence file, which he had removed and set in front of him, to be honored by successor if relevant. He read it twice. Then he set it down. "He was not an organized man, my father. He kept poor records. This was his idea of making something official." "Is it? Official?" He considered the word. "No, not legally. But it is something." He leaned back in his chair. "What did you intend to do with this information when you came here?" "I didn't know," she said. "I know that sounds like a poor answer. It sounds like an honest one." He picked up his pen and set it down again. "Your uncle's claim is not invalidated by my father's forgiveness." "Not directly. The two debts are separate. But if the forgiveness was properly recorded by my father's solicitor in Edinburgh," he paused. "And I suspect it was, because my father's solicitor was an extremely thorough woman who did not leave things half done. Then, there are implications for the timeline of what your uncle was building. If he knew the debt to the Aldenmere estate had been cleared, and he chose not to disclose that to your father when he was structuring the later loans, then he may have used my father's belief that he was in deeper debt than he was," Maren said. "Yes," he looked at her. "That is not a small thing." She knew it was not a small thing. She had known it for 6 weeks, which was how long she had been sitting with this knowledge in a house that belonged to a man she had not met, waiting for something she could not have named. "Why didn't you simply write to me?" he asked. She thought about how to answer that honestly. "Because I had no reason to believe you would open the letter," she said, "or that anyone here would have passed it to you rather than throwing it away. You are not, Your Grace, known for your accessibility." He was quiet for a moment. "No," he said, "I suppose I'm not." She did not leave Northgate Hall that evening, nor the next morning. Mrs. Aldwych, who had been told only that the Duke wished Miss Calloway to remain while certain matters were resolved, received this instruction with perfect equanimity and relocated Maren to a room on the second floor that was considerably better than the one she had been occupying. Maren sat in it that first night and looked at the ceiling and tried to understand what had happened. He had sent letters that evening. She did not know to whom, but she had heard the horse leaving after supper. And by the next afternoon there were 2 replies on the silver tray in the hall, both sealed with notary stamps. On the 3rd day, he asked her to come to the library again. "My father's solicitor kept a record," he said. He had one of the replies open on the desk. The debt was formally cleared and recorded in September 1892. "There is a duplicate file in Edinburgh." He looked up. "Your uncle's solicitor was the same solicitor who handled the original loan agreements, the same firm." He paused. "A firm which, it emerges, he had a financial interest in." Maren was quiet for a moment. Outside the windows the north garden was bright with the particular insistence of a May afternoon, the kind of afternoon that goes on long past when it should end. He made sure my father never knew the debt to your family was cleared, she said. It appears so, yes. She had known this was likely. She had known it was the shape of it from the moment she had found those letters in the drawer. Knowing it and hearing it confirmed in a quiet room by a person who was not her, who had no reason to say it if it were not true, were two different things. She pressed her hands flat against the arms of the chair and kept her voice even. What does that mean, legally? It means your uncle's claim on the estate was constructed on foundations he deliberately obscured. It means there are grounds to challenge the filing. He set the letter down. It does not mean the challenge will succeed. These things are slow and expensive, and the outcome is not guaranteed. But it means there are grounds. She nodded. Miss Calloway. His voice shifted, fractionally, to something that was not warmer exactly, but was less formal. Do you have a solicitor? I had my father's solicitor. I can no longer afford his firm. Then I will retain someone on your behalf, with your permission, and the costs will be my concern. Not a charity, he said, before she could respond. My father created this situation, in part, by his carelessness with records. That is not your problem to pay for. She looked at him. He was watching her with the same directness he had brought to every conversation they had had in this room, the same quality of attention that did not flinch and did not offer more than it was prepared to deliver. Why? She asked. I've told you why. You've told me a reason. I'm asking why you care. He was silent for a moment, long enough that she thought he might not answer. Because what was done to you was wrong, he said, and I have the means to address it, and I find that in the absence of any compelling reason not to, I prefer to do the right thing. It was such a plain statement. She had expected something more guarded, more hedged, and the plainness of it did something to her defenses that the more eloquent statement would not have. All right, she said. All right, he agreed, and reached for his pen. She stayed at Northgate Hall through May and then through June. It was not precisely comfortable in the beginning. She was no longer parlor staff and not yet anything else, and the house had no category for what she was. Mrs. Aldwick treated her with careful courtesy and occasional bewilderment. The cook, a pragmatic woman named Bessie, who had been at the hall for 20 years, treated her with straightforward indifference, which Maren found she preferred. She spent her mornings in the library, going through the box files with a thoroughness she had not been able to exercise on her first visit. He had given her permission and a lamp and occasional annotation because he knew those records better than she did, and he had the habit, which she found unexpected and oddly charming, of leaving notes on small slips of paper tucked into files she might find useful. Not explanatory, exactly, pointing. See also the 1889 correspondence with the Edinburgh factor. Or simply, this is wrong. Per the November accounts, she spent her afternoons writing letters, or walking in the north garden, or sitting in the kitchen when Bessie would tolerate her, which was most of the time. She saw him at odd hours. He kept his unusual schedule, and she did not modify hers to intersect with it, and yet they intersected with increasing frequency. At the end of a hallway. In the passage to the library. Once, late on a Tuesday evening, in the kitchen, where she had come for hot water, and he had come, apparently, for cold tea, which he drank standing up beside the range while she filled her mug, both of them pretending that this was unremarkable. You're still awake, he said. So are you. I usually am. He looked at the mug in her hands. Chamel? It helps. He nodded as though filing this away, and she looked at him in the lamplight and thought that he was not at all what she had expected from any version of this that she had imagined. The reputation was real, the distance, the stillness, the particular quality of his attention that could feel, from the outside, like being assessed rather than seen. But there was something beneath it that was patient rather than cold, careful, in the way of someone who had learned that carelessness costs. She had spent a lot of time, in the weeks since the library, wondering about 14 years. She had not asked him directly, but she had asked around the edges in the way she was good at, and what she had gathered was simply that he had come to the hall when he inherited it, and had stayed. Not out of misery or reclusion, exactly, more as though the world outside had continued without him, and he had led it. One evening in June she asked him. They were in the library, which had become by that point a shared space in the way that spaces become shared. Not by any declaration, but by the accumulation of two people spending time in them. He was at the desk. She was in the chair by the window, which she had informally adopted. "You were a barrister," she said, "before." He looked up from what he was reading. "Yes, in Edinburgh, yes, and you gave it up when you inherited. I did." She considered her next question carefully. "Did you want to?" He was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. "But I was the Duke, and there was no one else, and Northgate Hall was in a rather poor state of management. It needed attention." He paused. "I told myself I would return to Edinburgh eventually." The eventually kept arriving and passing. He looked at her with something that was almost amusement. "You're wondering why I stayed. I am, yes. Because after a while," he said, "I stopped wanting to leave." Which is not the same thing as wanting to stay, at first. But eventually it becomes so. She thought about this. About arriving somewhere not by choice and discovering, over time, that you had made it yours without noticing. She did not say what she was thinking, but she thought he understood it anyway, because he was watching her with that quality of attention that she had stopped finding unnerving and started finding something else entirely. Something she did not name, because it was June, and the legal matter was not yet resolved, and she was not yet certain of enough things to name anything. The case took until September. Her uncle's solicitor, faced with the documented evidence of the firm's conflict of interest and the Edinburgh records showing the clear debt, withdrew the original filing in August. It was not a complete victory. There were subsequent negotiations, a settlement that returned Thornfield Grange to her name, but attached conditions that her own solicitor spent 3 weeks arguing down. But by the 1st of September, the house was hers. She received the news in the library, in the chair by the window, on an afternoon that had turned cool with the first suggestion of autumn. He had been there when the letter came, and he had read it with her, not over her shoulder but present, sitting at the desk, because by September that was how they were. "Well," she said. "Yes," he agreed. She looked out the window at the north garden, which was going golden at the edges. She thought about Thornfield Grange, the cracked plaster ceiling in the east hallway, the sound the back gate made when the wind came from the south. She thought about going back to it. She thought about the kitchen on a Tuesday night, and cold tea and chamomile and small slips of paper left in files she hadn't yet found. "It will need work," she said. "The estate. It's been 8 months. It will. I'll need a decent solicitor going forward. Someone who knows the northern estates. I can recommend one." She turned from the window and looked at him. He was watching her, as he had been watching her, she thought, for longer than either of them had yet acknowledged. "I don't actually want to leave," she said. It was a plain statement. She had learned, in the month since the library, that plain statements worked better in this room than any other kind. He was quiet for a moment, long enough that she thought she had miscalculated, and she was already constructing a graceful way to fold it back into something more manageable. And then he said, "I don't want you to leave either." "That's good," she said. "Yes," he said. "I think it probably is." Outside, the first autumn wind came off the hills and moved through the north garden, and the gold-edged leaves turned in it like they had somewhere to be, and the afternoon light stretched long and pale across the stone floor of the library and reached almost to where she was sitting, which was as close to the desk as she had ever been. She stayed.